board of the Princeton Adult School. I'd like to welcome you to the first in our fall 2003 Ann B. Shepard lecture series, Utopia. Before we move on to these lofty utopian ideas, however, there are a couple of real-life topics I need to address. First, you may have noticed that we are not in Princeton High School. We learned in midsummer, long after our program had been complete, that the high school auditorium might not be available to us this fall because of construction. It was through the good offices of Pam Hirsch, who's director of the university's Office of Community and State Affairs, that we're here. This series is being co-sponsored by Pam's Community Audit Program, and we're pleased to welcome any of you who are here through that program. If you appreciate this wonderful venue, I want to thank Pam for that. She promised me she'd be here tonight, but you can certainly thank her. I want to thank Pam and Princeton University for their generosity. Second on my real-life list, busy schedules changed over the summer. There have been some shifting among the lecturers since the catalog was printed. The lectures themselves are all the same, but the order has been rearranged in the middle of the series for a couple of them. The revised order is on the back of your ticket, which brings me to my final item. Anyone who's registered for the full series should have received a ticket when you came in tonight. Since we're at the university, we had them printed on tiger orange. Your ticket is for the whole series. Bring it with you to each lecture and just show it at the door. You won't have to check in this lengthy process. They're so bright that I suspect if you just open your purse or your wallet, we'll be able to see the glow. The tickets are transferable. That is, we really don't care who brings the ticket, but they are not replaceable. If you lose it, you'll have to check in off the list each time. And yes, for those of you who haven't been to Adult School Series before, they are taped. Yulia Zaks from TV Channel 30, our local public access television, is doing the taping. The tapes from this series will be available at Princeton Public Library and at the Mercer County Library about a month after the series is completed. Although I don't know the schedule, they will also be shown on TV 30 more than once. Now, let's get on to the good stuff, utopia. Thomas More coined the word, but certainly not the concept, of a visionary commonwealth. The idea preceded the 16th century by millennia. In this series, we're going to explore 7 of these utopias: ancient and modern, practical and impossibly optimistic, political and artistic. Although we couldn't arrange it chronologically, the schedules being realistic rather than perfect, we are going to begin our explorations in classical Greece. And we're fortunate indeed to have Josiah Ober to take us back to ancient Athens for utopias then and utopias to follow. Josiah Ober is David Maggie 97, class of 1897, professor of classics, University Center for Human Values at Princeton, a graduate of the University of Minnesota and the University of Michigan. Professor Ober has been at Princeton since 1990, and he was chair of the classics department from 1993 to 2000. He has taught and had fellowships at places as far removed from each other as Montana and Sorbonne, and Australia and Cambridge. His list of articles, chapters, books written, books edited is long and impressive. Since this is the video age, perhaps you saw him, as I did this summer, on a television program about ancient Sparta. He was commenting on it, not appearing as a Spartan reenactor. His current research interests focus on circulation of useful knowledge and its relationship to ancient Athens and modernity, and on non-governmental organizations and human values. I guess it really is true that everything old is new again. All this bodes well for us tonight as he helps us understand our first utopia, ancient Athens, Plato's beautiful city.
Thank you very much. It is a great pleasure and really an honor to be able to open this series when Louise Grafton asked me to speak in this series and told me some of the other people who would be speaking. I was kind of overawed, thinking that she probably made a mistake and she might want to think again I didn't feel that I really belonged in that sort of company. It really is an honor, and you are, whatever you get out of tonight, you're in for a tremendous treat in the lectures to come. There are really some spectacular speakers and some awfully good topics. Well, it certainly makes some sense to begin a study of utopias with the Greeks, given that our English word utopia is coined from Greek roots. That is from eu, meaning good or well, and topos, meaning place. So to say that a society is a utopia is to assert that it's a good place to live in, indeed perhaps the best imaginable place. But the Greeks themselves didn't actually use the word utopia. They coined lots of eu root terms that are related to the idea of a good society or even to the best society. Eunomia, meaning a well-regulated society, is an especially important Greek term. And eupolis, the good city, was actually used as a man's common name, or proper name. But they never used the particular term utopia to refer to a best place that was also, at least for the time being, a non-place, that is, an atopia. That is, they never developed a philosophical terminology for the philosophical project of constructing an ideal city in words. So while utopia is constructed out of standard Greek terms, and it would have been a perfectly understandable word for the Greeks themselves to have invented and to have used, the Greeks actually did not have a word for it in this case. That is, they didn't have a word for a place that is both best and, for now anyway, non-existent. Which is really sort of striking, because there are indeed several preserved literary examples of the ancient Greek utopian political thought experiment. By far the best known, I think, and the subject of my talk this evening is Plato's great Socratic dialogue, The Republic, in which the philosopher, Plato speaking through Socrates, recounts a surely imaginary conversation in which Socrates, in the company of several friends and intellectual competitors and companions, constructs a city in words, the city that the assembled company calls Kallipolis, the beautiful city. Well, before we get into the text of the Republic itself, because that's what I'm going to want to do tonight, is actually sort of work through some parts of the argument of the Republic with you. Before we do that, we might want to ask a prior question, and that is, why would a philosopher choose to write utopian literature? Why spend a lot of time and effort describing a society that doesn't exist? And at least in the case of Plato's Kallipolis, in all likelihood, never will. Well, we'll never really be able to answer that motivational question, at least for Plato, in any definitive way, but there are some pretty strong hints in the autobiographical text known as the Seventh Letter. That's a work that's either by Plato himself or by one of his close associates at the Academy, that is the think tank that he founded outside of Athens. According to the letter, Plato's utopian project was stimulated by his thwarted political ambitions. That is, his perfectly ordinary Greek ambition to gain fame and do some good in the public sphere. Well, as reported in the letter, young Plato, it's all written in first person, as if it were by Plato, whether it is or not. Young Plato, who, as we know, was born to an aristocratic Athenian family, and who was fired up with the ideas that he had developed in years of listening to Socrates. Young Plato was eager, he says, to play a part in Athenian politics. His opportunity seemed to come after the Athenian democracy lost the Peloponnesian War, because then democracy, which in its pre-Peloponnesian War phase didn't really attract Plato very much, but when the democracy was overthrown by certain of his own kinsmen, by certain of his relatives, working closely with the victorious Spartans. Well, Plato, as the letter recounts, believed that the new government, run by the best people, after all, my relatives are be the best people, aren't they? Some of them, like his uncle Critias, who had been students of Socrates themselves, he believed this would be a new political beginning for Athens. And so, as he says in the letter, he eagerly joined them. But his hopes of working to institute a pristine but a just regime were quickly dashed. The new government quickly proved to be a collective tyranny. The Athenians later called it the era of the 30 tyrants, because there were 30 main leaders, including Critias and other of Plato's relatives. They proved to be vicious, murderous, and greedy. And indeed, they proved to be eager to implicate others in their wickedness, including Socrates, whom they sent off to arrest somebody for no particular crime, to bring him back to Athens in order to execute him, simply so they could steal his money. Socrates refused to do it, but at this moment Plato began to realize what a nasty group of people he'd gotten himself in with. And as a result, Plato withdrew from this anti-democratic government in frustration, refused to have anything more to do with it. Well, the collective tyranny led not only to Plato's disgusted withdrawal from politics, at least for the moment, but it also led to a democratic counter-revolution. And that counter-revolution quickly led to the overthrow of the 30, the killing of various of them, including Plato's relative Critias in battle, and reinstituted democracy. Plato, at this point, according to the 7th letter, was elated. He thought this was great. His relatives, or the people around, the particular relatives, the 30 turned out to be real rotters. They were gone. Now the democracy was back, and he says, this really looked like an age of gold compared to the ugly regime of the 30. So a little more hesitantly, I would guess a lot more hesitantly, I mean, after all, Plato was closely associated with some of these guys, but a little more hesitantly, he tells us, he prepared once again to begin a political career. I mean, the guy must have been awfully optimistic at this point, and this time as a participant in the newly restored democratic regime. But then, he says in the letter, comes the final catastrophe, the trial and the execution of Socrates. This seemed to show that human beings, as they are in the here and now, are just not capable of living together under conditions of justice. As it turned out, this rule of the best people was no damn good. The rule of the many was just no damn good. So what are you going to do? You throw up your hands if you're Plato and you say you're going to withdraw from active engagement in politics. Ultimately, he withdraws to the academy, outside the walls of the city of Athens, although still within Athenian territory, where he would spend pretty much the rest of his life engaged in teaching and writing, including the project of writing the work that we'll be exploring tonight, that is, the Republic. So, Plato's utopianism, if we're to believe the 7th letter, Plato's utopianism begins with the thought, gee, it's much harder than I thought it would be to achieve a decent society. Neither the better people, my aristocratic relatives and their friends, nor the many, that is, the Democrats who retook the city from the aristocrats, neither the many or the few seem to have a clue about how to create a just society. But moreover, thinks Plato, even after years of listening to Socrates, it turns out that I don't have a clue either. And so if I'm a philosopher, and certainly Plato thought of himself as a philosopher, I have to ask myself, why is that? And it turns out to be because I don't, Plato doesn't, yet actually know the answer to the big question of ethics. And in the words of my colleague Anthony Papia, the big question of ethics is, what makes a life go well? Plato doesn't know that yet. He's got to figure it out. Well, why can't I answer that question? Asks Plato. Why can't I say, what is it that makes a life go well? Why don't I know? Well, it's because I don't know what justice really amounts to yet. And so it's a problem in part of political knowledge. I'm going to actually have to learn something about, going to have to gain some political knowledge. And I don't really yet understand why people act the way they do. So it's a problem of moral psychology, or in Plato's terminology, it's a problem of the soul. And when I talk about the problem of the soul tonight, I'm not talking about a Christian conception of the soul as something that necessarily lives on after death and so on. I'm talking about a Platonic conception of the soul that is your inner life, your own moral psychology. So I don't understand what justice is. I need political knowledge. I don't understand why people do what they do. It's a problem of moral psychology. And I don't yet know how to make people good. So it's also a problem of education. So how should, if I'm Plato, how should I go about learning what it is for a life to go well, given that I'm pretty sure that it requires living under conditions of justice, whatever that is. It requires a well-ordered soul, whatever that is, and it requires the capacity to teach others what it is to make their lives go well. Which, when you think about it, in terms of where Plato started, he's got a pretty good starting point. He knows it's about justice, he knows it's about moral psychology, he knows it's about education, and so perhaps all those years of listening to Socrates did him some good after all. Well, the ordinary Greek approach to this question of ethics, what makes a life go well, as in many other societies, is look to the past for instruction. So you might think about a good place to start in terms of sort of standard Greek approaches to this would be something like Herodotus' story about Solon's response to the king Croesus, the richest man in the world, the king of Lydia, when Croesus asked Solon, who had the reputation for wisdom, "Oh, Solon, Greek visitor to beautiful Lydia, who do you suppose, Solon, is the happiest man in the world? I just showed you my storerooms. You just had a nice dinner. There's a pretty obvious answer staring you in the face, Solon," says Croesus, according to Herodotus. And Solon scratches his head a moment and he says, "Well, Croesus, richest man in the world, I guess I'd probably have to say that the happiest man in the world, that is, the man whose life went best, was my countryman, Tellus." Croesus looks at him like, hello. He says, "So what's so great about Tellus? Why did his life go so well? Why is he so happy?" And Solon said, "Well, he had moderate property, adequate for us, nothing like this, of course, but moderate property. His children all lived to grow up, and they had children of their own. He died in battle for his country, and his countrymen built him a very nice funeral monument to commemorate the act." That seems to be for Solon, the happiest man in the world. Well, Herodotus tells this story. The point is that he tells this story through the mouth of long-dead Solon. Solon was just a memory in Herodotus' time. And Solon himself refers to Tellus, who is far in his own past. And so the standard approach to trying to figure out what is happiness, what is it for a life to go well, is to look further and further into the past. Okay? To imagine that once upon a time, somebody knew what it was for a life to go well, and if we get far enough into the past, maybe we can find it out. But Plato, like Socrates, thought that was the wrong way to go about it. The historical Socrates, the real Socrates, who walked around and lived and taught in Athens, seemed to think that the way to figure it out was to start out with investigating ordinary people's moral intuitions, to see what was left of them after what was left of those intuitions after they were subjected to the strict logic of philosophical conversation. You all know the stories about Socrates' conversations, or irritating conversations. Indeed, at least to many people who were engaged in them, although very satisfactory, apparently, to Socrates. And Plato certainly thought that Socrates had made a lot of headway in having these conversations, starting with people's intuitions and just taking them apart until something or nothing is actually left. Yet Socrates was executed, as you know, in 399 BC. And Plato was deeply confused about what he should do in the period 400 to 399 BC. And he was even more confused, apparently, after 399, after the death of Socrates, which suggests that Plato didn't suppose that Socrates had got it all the way right. At least all the way right in a way that would explain to Plato what it would be for his own life to go well. I think the failure of Socrates' actual teachings, indeed his entire life as a paradigm for Plato, is implicit in the fact that Plato was planning to live his life one way, that is, in a politically active way, until the moment of the trial and execution of Socrates, when he suddenly, or at least so he says in the 7th letter, decided he must live his life an entirely different way in order for it to have any possibility that it would go well. So if Socrates had the answer, if he basically, was telling people like Plato, well, yeah, I have all these conversations in the Agora, I pretend to be ignorant, but come here, I'll tell you the secret to a happy life, and it's this. Then Plato would have known, and he would have known exactly how to live his life, and living his life presumably wouldn't have anything to do, living a good life wouldn't have anything to do with Socrates is killed or not killed. He wouldn't be confused, he would know the secret to living a good life. But he doesn't know that. He is confused. He's got to actually figure it out for himself. So there's a lot of work for Plato to do still after the death of Socrates, and that work, insofar as we know about it at all, is done in the academy, and we get some hints of it in the dialogues. They're the method and the fruits of Plato's attempt to get clear on the big questions of moral philosophy, and along the way, on questions of logic and epistemology and mathematics and metaphysics, which he supposed, in a sense, you've got to do all together in order to get any of them right. Well, Plato's remarkable breakthrough approach to the moral philosophy part of it, anyway, in the Republic, is that one way to make a real advance on understanding these complicated matters, these, it seems so simple how to have a life go well. You just tell us, for heaven's sake, have your kids live and, die in battle and so on. But it turns out it's not that, so it's complicated. The way to make an advance on these complicated matters, and one way to communicate what you've learned to others, Plato figures, is by an elaborate thought experiment. In his terms, building a city in words. And what I'm going to suggest, and really sort of the key to what my whole argument tonight, is that what Plato's doing in this utopia is trying to answer this hard question of what is it that makes a life go well, okay? How should I live my life? So he's going to figure that out by building a city in words, by, in fact, making a utopia. Well, Plato argued that having done that great verbal experiment, one might in fact understand what was necessary to know, that is, the conditions of justice, the conditions of the human soul, and how people could be properly educated so as to understand what it would mean for their lives to go truly well. And so off we go. This is what we hope to get in reading the Republic. Off we go to what turns out to be a pretty strange destination. A destination is the Athenian town. Athens is a whole territory with a city and then various towns associated with it. So we're going to go to the Athenian town of Piraeus. That's where the Republic reportedly takes place. The whole of the Republic, the dialogue, is reported secondhand by Socrates. It begins with the evocative words, "Yesterday I," that is Socrates, "went down to the Piraeus with Glaucon, the son of Ariston." Well, what does it matter that he's going some particular place? What do we care? He's not going to write about the Piraeus. That's not utopia, far from it. What's the diff? Well, the Piraeus is at the center of, is a primary center of democratic activism, as it turns out. We wouldn't know this from reading Plato's dialogue. I'm telling you this as a Greek historian. The Piraeus is the place where Plato's Uncle Critias was killed in the battle that ended the regime of the 30 tyrants. And Socrates, we quickly find out, is gone down to the Piraeus yesterday. He's reporting this whole thing that happened yesterday. He's gone down there to see something, to see what we might call a multicultural cultural spectacle. That is the new festival of the goddess Bendis, recently imported from Thrace and officially introduced to the city of Athens. There's going to be all kinds of neat parades and races and the celebration of new religious rites. Socrates then sort of reports himself in the beginning of this dialogue as a kind of local tourist. It's his hometown. They're doing something new. He's going to go down to, in a sense, the suburbs. As it turns out, these very dramatically important suburbs for political reasons. He's going to go, he is fascinated as a tourist, apparently, by the diversity offered by the most democratic place in the very democratic city-state. And his companion in tourism is this guy Glaucon, son of Ariston. Aha, turns out to be Plato's brother. So the setting is already pretty striking. Now, as Socrates reports it, he had done his rites to the goddess. He'd seen various parades and so on. There was more stuff going on in the evening, but he was about ready to go home when he ran into a group of his friends, including Polemarchus, a resident foreigner who lived in the town of Piraeus with his elderly father, Cephalus. Now, once again, the setting is pretty dramatic. We know, and presumably Plato's original readers knew too, that the family of Cephalus and Polemarchus was going to be shattered, and Polemarchus himself was going to be killed by the 30 tyrants. The setting of this republic is some years before that happened, right? It's back in sort of the innocent days before the 30, but we know that there's going to be horrible blood on the ground. And so the happy gathering is shadowed for us as readers by our knowledge of the horrible results of the civil conflict, by horrible results of bad rulership and injustice. Everything that is possible inside the house of Cephalus is going to be made impossible by the awful political events that are still to come, awful political events that were actually going to change Plato's whole thinking, as we just heard, about the possibility of engaging effectively in politics himself, personally. Well, back in the dialogue, Socrates meets up with these friends who don't know yet that they're going to be killed or their lives all disrupted in a civil war. Agrees to hang out for a while at Cephalus and Polemarchus' house. So he joins up there with a group of citizens and non-citizens, old friends and intellectual opponents. Well, the conversation, because it's going to be a conversation, you're not going to sit around and just eat or you're going to watch a video or something with Socrates. You're going to have a serious intellectual conversation. So conversation quickly gets down to serious topics, and the topic is what is justice and what good is justice. There's some initial verbal jousting, very gentle jousting with Cephalus, who's treated very respectfully by Socrates, and then Polemarchus, who is kind of like this a sweet young kitten who sort of he gets sort of jostled about a little bit. But then comes on this guy Thrasymachus, who's a heavier piece of work. Thrasymachus is a straight-up amoralist who thinks that justice is simply a waste of time, and the best thing for you to do is to appear just so everybody treats you nicely, but actually be radically unjust, and so use your secret injustice to get all kinds of goods. And he says that anybody who's really honest would admit that's what they really want. The appearance of being just, but the actuality of being very unjust and taking much more than your share, but what you really want. So you've got going to have a discussion with this guy who's really a straight up moralist. Okay, and it looks at this point as if we're going to have a kind of standard Socratic dialogue. This is just the way Socratic dialogues start. You have a few little it's like the the warm-up acts or something, with some people who, Socrates sort of beats up a little bit, but in kind of a nice way. And then comes up the big, heavy guy that you're going to have the serious conversation with. We think it's going to be Thrasymachus, but it's not. As it turns out, Thrasymachus drops out of the conversation quite quickly, and the rest of the dialogue is not this kind of verbal jousting that is ultimately going to leave people's intuitions basically pretty much in tatters and leave everybody sort of scratching their heads and sort of going home thinking, yeah, I guess we need a whole lot more work on that topic. Instead, the conversation turns to a kind of a private conversation between Socrates and his friends Glaucon and Adimantus. Adimantus, as it turns out, is Plato's other brother. So it's Socrates talking with Plato's two brothers about justice. And pretty quickly it turns out we're going to do some real work here. We're not just going to tear things apart, we're going to build something up. So this is new. This is different from the other dialogues, from the earlier dialogues. Like Socrates, Plato's brothers, Glaucon and Adimantus, believe that it's imperative to make an argument that it proves that justice is a good in itself, and that doing just acts is choice-worthy, is something we would choose in and of itself, not just because justice is a way to avoid punishment, not just because it's a way to gain the praise of others. And this is really a tall order, since it demands, we're spinning off of what Thrasymachus had proposed, it demands that we accept that a truly just man, living under ghastly physical conditions, and wrongly believed by everyone around him to be unjust, so he's being punished for things he's never done, is actually happier. His life is going better than the truly unjust man who possesses everything that he ever wanted and who everybody around him thinks is actually living a life of justice. Everyone thinks he's good, but actually he's wicked, he's getting everything that he wants. So he lives in a life of material pleasure, gets everything he wants. He is actually much unhappier than the just man who seems to be living so miserably. And that sets up a really interesting challenge. What is the relationship between justice and the conditions of the human soul? Since the just man seems to have a soul that is at rest, whereas the unjust man's soul is not at rest. Now that's a tough one, says Socrates. This is the challenge that basically Glaucon and Adimantus say, ooh, that's tough. That's really tough. Now why is that so tough? It's because the soul is so little. And it's going to be hard to see justice, a little bit of justice inside that little teeny thing, the soul. But maybe, he thinks, just maybe, we might be able to understand the nature of justice in the human soul if it were true that a soul is kind of like a city. And then we could build a city in words, and a city is a really big thing. And therefore, as a big thing, it would have room for a lot of justice in it, and then we could see that big lot of justice and study it pretty carefully, and since, by the argument, it's kind of like a soul, then we could just extrapolate back from a big thing to a little thing, and we'd know what justice was like in the soul. He says it's kind of like reading, big letters on a big billboard. They're really easy to see and make out, especially if you, like me, have to have these. Instead of these itsy-bitsy little letters, you can just sort of read the letters more easily because they're bigger, so there'll be more justice, more easy to see. And the question we have to ask at this point is, Plato, are you pulling our leg here? I mean, this seems the silliest argument that in all of the Platonic corpus. Philosophers have, in fact, seriously suggested this may be a joke. That there may be, that there's something so bizarre about this little teeny bit of justice in the little teeny soul and the great big bunch of justice in the great big city that at least one thought is that Plato is joking. If it's true, it's a rather rare one. I mean, Plato doesn't really make a lot of jokes. Socrates kind of seems to be engaged in sort of humorous things. Plato himself as a writer, it's a strange thing going on. Well, the fascinating thing is that the ostensible project of understanding the soul, that is moral psychology, seemingly renders the utopian project of political philosophy, that is understanding justice in a community, as a mere instrumental means to an end. It leaves wide open the question of whether we're supposed to take Kallipolis as a genuine political ideal, whether it's imagined as an ideal we could achieve or not, or whether Kallipolis, this city we're going to build in words, is merely a very strange, and we might think very roundabout way, to discover truths about moral psychology, that is, about our souls. And there's just no very tidy answer to that question. Is he serious or isn't he? Is this model meant to only look at the soul, or are we actually supposed to be worried about justice in the city as well? Philosophers have argued about this for a long time, and I think the fact that there is no agreement about philosophers about how seriously we're supposed to take this city-soul analogy points to the fact, I take it to be a fact, that Plato didn't intend that question to be easily answered. He wants us to be constantly worried about what we're supposed to be getting out of this dialogue. Are we supposed to just be worrying about, what's inside us, the conditions of our souls? Are we supposed to actually be worried about the kinds of cities that we really might want to live in if we were able to actually go ahead and do some work to build that kind of community? Well, the assembled company in Cephalus and Polemarchus' house formally resolves to carry out the task of imaginary city building. They say, let it be resolved that we shall take on this big project. So, having made that resolution, Socrates posits an original social contract. He gets his project of community building going with a basic social contract. Pretty straightforward move. That is, he suggests the polis as an entity first comes into being because individual human beings are incapable of living outside of a community. Each self-interested individual requires cooperative association with many others in order to fulfill his needs and desires. This is a very straightforward political philosophy move. Why do we, need politics at all? Because we actually can't achieve what we individually want to achieve unless we live in association with one another. All pretty straightforward. But Socrates immediately adds a remarkable stipulation. Since, he says, each individual only does one thing well, therefore, he just asserts this, and everybody sort of nodded, yeah, that's right, each individual only does one thing well. Therefore, strict functional specialization is going to be essential in our ideal city. That is, each person will only do one thing. No double dipping here. Shoemakers are not going to be engaged in politics and vice versa. Well, the import of this move is immediately apparent. Since earning a living is one thing and ruling is another thing, those who must work for a living, like shoemakers, or probably like most of us, those who actually have to provide the economic basis of their own lives and of society, are forbidden to have any part in ruling. That's just the rules of the game here, because we've agreed, without anybody making any fuss about this, that people can only do one thing well, and therefore should only do one thing. This means right away, no democracy. The standard Athenian democratic principle is ruled by what we might call knowledgeable amateurs. That is, a shoemaker can be chosen by lottery to be a magistrate of the state, and often was. That's just ruled out from the very beginning by what philosophers call the unique aptitude doctrine. Any thought that Kallipolis might end up being a democracy is put to rest right from the get-go. Kallipolis, then, is designed right from the beginning, from its first principles, to be the very antithesis of that political state that lies outside Cephalus' doorway, the diverse and the exciting democracy characterized by political participation of shoemakers and salesmen and sailors and other people who had to work for their living. Well, the first candidate for the ideal city that emerges from the discussion is a rather simple community in which there are no luxury goods at all. We're starting out sort of building small, and sort of adding things as we need them. That's sort of as this company of friends does. So we're starting out with no unnecessary luxury goods. People in this first take at a good city, at an ideal city, at a utopia, people would eat rather crude food, simple food, served on woven reeds and leaves. Sort of imagine these sort of hunter-gatherer societies, although there is going to be agriculture, it turns out. They're going to recline on the ground for much of the time. They're not going to have, fancy couches and beds and so on. They'll just have nothing in excess. And that sort of society, Socrates points out, would live in peace. It would not excite the attention or the desires of neighbors, since there's simply nothing that the society has that's worth seizing, and so there would be no need for an army, no need for a warrior class. And Socrates seems initially, anyway, very pleased with this construct, and he waxes on about its healthiness and its lack of unnecessary pretense. It seems like there that the project of designing a utopian community is going to be pretty easy. We'll just have this simple kind of healthy place where we'll all just sort of eat our basic kind of stuff on our little woven reed mats, and we'll lie on the ground. I guess in our spare time we'll talk philosophy, but he doesn't even get around to saying that. But stop! Socrates' friend Glaucon, remember Plato's brother, pipes up, "What, Socrates? You may as well be designing a city for pigs!" Glaucon seems to be particularly offended by the point that Socrates makes along the way, because he says, "Well, what are we going to have for dessert, Socrates?" And Socrates basically says, "Acorns." And that's the moment he says, "Dang, this is just not going to make it. That's pig food. I'm just not going to do it." And he said, "And meanwhile, I don't like this lying on the ground thing either. I want a comfortable couch, for heaven's sake. I want to live like an ordinary, sort of aristocratic sort of person." And Socrates, you're expecting Socrates to come in and say, "Now come on, Glaucon, let's be serious. Why do you need that? Why do you desire that? Are those good desires? Have you thought that through?" No, he says, "Okay, that's all right, but that means our city is going to have to be much more elaborate, you realize, Glaucon, because we've now introduced luxury goods, desirable goods. It's no longer going to be just healthy and simple and small and peaceful. Since the city will now include all these luxuries that are dear to Glaucon's heart, it'll also have to have an army to defend those goods against all the neighboring states that will naturally hope to take those goods for themselves." Well, this is just a key moment, because the unique aptitude doctrine, which had been slipped in right at the very beginning, means that those who will serve as soldiers in defense of Callipolis' luxuries cannot be the same people who provide the material goods. We can't have farmers as soldiers. We can't have shoemakers as soldiers. Like everyone else in Callipolis, the soldiers have to just do one thing, that thing that they do well. And this is going to mean that this city is going to be very different, not just from Athens, but from most other Greek city-states as well, in which farmers at least served as soldiers who defended their state against aggression. We can't have that. Now, the soldiers of Callipolis, people who are initially called guardians, are frequently compared by Socrates to dogs. And as such, they're expected to act fiercely to all outsiders. Plato, by the way, loves these animal metaphors. He's a gadfly. The Athenian people are a big lazy horse. The guardians are dogs. There's something to be done about Plato's zoology. At any rate, the dog-like nature of the guardians underlines the need for strict and careful obedience training. You have dogs guarding your city, you've got to have them trained right. Since only the guardians will have arms and armor, they will have a monopoly on effective force, and so they'll be naturally tempted to use their superior strength to take goods from other members of the society, that is, to bite the hand that feeds them. And if that happens, the society would devolve into oppression and viciousness, and utopia will be lost before it started. So what's needed is a very special education for the guardians, one that will instill in each of them a deep sense of obedience and will eliminate any tendency towards greediness or grabbiness. And thus, almost by accident, just because Glaucon can't stand the idea of lying on the ground and eating perfectly healthy acorns, the founders of Kallipolis embark upon what is one of the most immediately striking and obvious aspects of Plato's utopian project, that is, its deep concern with formal education, with the education specifically of the guardians, but ultimately the education of all members of the community. Now, the burden of that education is essentially to defeat what Plato supposes is the ordinary human capacity to disobey and to overreach, to grab more than your fair share, using whatever means are available for self-aggrandizement. So the assumption is for Symmachus, sort of moral psychology is pretty common. People will grab what they can if they're given the chance. We have to defeat that tendency through education. Well, the concern with teaching obedience ultimately requires a program of strict censorship. Kallipolis residents will learn obedience in the most profound sense of not ever learning that disobedience to established authority is even possible. Now, this requires, as it turns out, that literature be censored. The Theogony, the story about the birth of the gods of Hesiod, for example, is not going to be allowed in Kallipolis because it's full of stories of rebellion by sons, for example, Kronos and Zeus, rebelling against their divine fathers. And likewise with Homer and most of the rest of Greek literature, it's all going to have to be eliminated or at least tidied up, lest the citizens of Kallipolis mimic the acts of disobedience that so commonly motivate the plots of literary works. You don't want them learning that disobedience is even possible. Moreover, literature teaches that acts of injustice are instrumentally effective. There's all kinds of people in literature who succeed being unjust. We've got to get rid of that idea. People can't even know that that's a possibility. Nor can they know that change is desirable or natural. They can't come to think of that. That's very bad. Poetry is especially insidious, it turns out, in that it presents multiple aspects of complex situations and thus contributes to the formation of multiple opinions. This is the kind of thing we're always trying to teach our students, right? You read this novel or this poem or whatever, and you see different sides of it. Very bad. That means you've got different opinions in your soul, you've got conflict in your soul. We don't want any of that. We don't want disagreement, we don't want lack of consensus, and so we're going to get rid of all of that. Now, in the place of all of this literature, normally the center of Greek education, the education of Kallipolis will feature noble lies. That is, stories about human nature that are actually false, but good for people to believe in. Now, the central lie that sustains utopian Kallipolis is that people were originally born from the earth. This is actually, weirdly, a pretty common Greek myth, that people are born from the earth, but Plato's spin on it is that being born from the earth, each individual has a certain metallic content in his soul. It's sort of like, well, you're kind of earthy, so you're kind of metallic as well. It's a weird conception, but this is the great lie that everyone is told. And some people have iron in their souls. They're actually going to be the lowest class. They just, their capacities are limited because they have iron in their souls. Other people are somewhat better. They have bronze in their souls. Other people are considerably better, have silver in their souls. And best of all are the gold-souled people who are going to be the rulers of society. This topmost class will know that the noble lie is false. No one else is. Not even the silver-souled people are going to be tipped off to that one. And the gold-souled people are going to be responsible for perpetuating the society systematically among the inferior classes for their own good, of course. This is all for everybody's good. It's not exploitation. This is for your own good. Who are these mysterious gold-souled rulers? Now, it turns out they can't be guardians, since you remember that, or they can't be the people we originally called guardians, since the whole elaborate educational system was ultimately designed in order to provide the dog-like guardians with a special indoctrination in order to keep them gentle and tame to Kallipolis' other residents. So the lies are ultimately aimed at making the silver-souled guardians, or the original guardians, not just the iron and bronze-souled workers, into obedient servants of the regime. This is the point that Socrates introduces something new, the need for true guardians. Turned out that those original guardians weren't true guardians, they're just auxiliaries, although the actual identity of these true guardians is only going to be revealed later in the dialogue, and it's meant to be a real shocker. Well, meanwhile, Socrates goes on to specify the lifestyles of the guardians, the gold-souled ones, and the auxiliaries, the true guardians and the auxiliaries, which is going to be very austere indeed. The whole educational scheme on which Callipolis was grounded, it was predicated, you remember, on Glaucon's hopes for some decent food and a decent couch. But it turns out that the guardians and the auxiliaries will own no private property at all. Indeed, they won't even live in nuclear families. They won't even have their own wives or their own children. The guardians and auxiliaries will share one another as sexual partners and as fathers and mothers. It's a world of utter egalitarianism, and moreover, interestingly, it's gender blind. Women and men will both be guardians and auxiliaries. They will both do military service if they're of the silver-souled class. After all, Socrates quips when his interlocutors, it's a puzzle, isn't it? Whoa, Socrates, women, warriors, I don't think so. He says, well, look, female dogs and male dogs, equally fierce. What's the problem? Oh, well, that makes sense. Oddly, how? The logic behind this strict equality among the higher classes of Callipolis is similar to the logic behind the noble lies and the unique aptitude doctrine, that is, the desire to eliminate all sources of difference among citizens that might lead to disagreement or conflict or even civil war. Callipolis is beautiful in Plato's account because it's not racked by endless internal conflicts that he believed had debilitated all real city-states and thereby destroyed the possibility of true flourishing under secure and sustainable conditions of justice. It is security at all costs. Well, Callipolis is, we remember, meant to be the model for a single, perfectly integrated, internally consistent human soul. Which brings us back to the question of rulership and the identity of the true guardians, the gold-souled rulers of Callipolis who alone know the truth about their condition and who are responsible for maintaining the elaborate educational system that kept the society on track and free from conflict. Who were these rulers whose souls were at one, who were able to deal with the terrible truth about the human condition, all this conflict that is possible, disobedience is possible, but are going to reject that, who have no need, apparently, for noble lies. Well, Socrates, the main speaker in this long dialogue, seems unwilling to spill the beans. Oh, boy, it's going to be hard to say. It's just too much to believe. It's really too unlikely. Okay, but if you must know, it's philosophers. But Glaucon, they're amazed. Oh my God, Socrates, we never thought that. And Glaucon immediately puts Socrates on warning. He says, boy, when that gets out, many distinguished people will immediately strip naked and grabbing up whatever weapons lie at hands, they're going to rush right at you. This is weird. The image of naked armed men rushing at Socrates with weapons drawn is that of the most violent possible type of civil conflict. And indeed, it borrows directly from familiar Athenian imagery of tyrant killing. Every Athenian was deeply familiar with the stories of the tyrant killers, Harmodius and Aristogeiton, very familiar with the oversized, life-size, heroically nude statues of the tyrant killers in the Athenian marketplace, which figures these guys who are very improbably buck naked with swords, rushing at a tyrant, ready to give him a poke. That's what we're playing with here. Is basically the Athenians are going to think you're a tyrant if you say philosophers might actually rule. And once again, we have to think back on Plato's association with these people called the 30 tyrants. Well, Glaucon, Socrates' friend and intellectual companion, is just shocked at the idea of philosophers as kings. His horrific imagery of the popular response to such a notion portrays Socrates as an imagined tyrant about to be stabbed to death by a pack of his bizarrely naked fellow countrymen. The violence of the image brings us back to the question of whether Callipolis is meant to be taken seriously. We began this talk with Plato's decision, after the death of Socrates, to turn away from his ambitions for a political career, to turn towards philosophy as writing and teaching, rather than as a guide to engaging in real-world political activism. The philosopher-king ideal in Callipolis' utopian society seems to offer a way to allow someone like Plato to return to the political arena, but in an entirely new capacity. Not a competitor in political contests, not as someone who must woo an electorate, but as an educator, ruler who will be obeyed unquestioningly by all others as a result of their peculiar education in noble lives. Now, did Plato actually see this as a desirable end? Did he really imaginatively inhabit this beautiful city he built in words? Did he imagine himself, perhaps, as that philosopher king? Well, some passages in the Republic suggested that he did not, that the city really was nothing more than a model to understand the human soul. Perhaps it's just the case that for our lives to go well is just to accept that we should get our own souls in order, seek to eliminate conflict and confusion from our own individual psychologies. But there are other passages in which that individual-centered conclusion just doesn't seem enough. When Adimantus notes that a person who keeps quiet, minds his own business, without committing injustice or impiety, and finally dying with fair hope, that person, says Adimantus, has not accomplished the least of things. Socrates replies, yes, but not the greatest of things either. For if he did not happen to find a suitably organized city, for in a suitable one, that person would have expanded his capacity and that he would be able to preserve communal public affairs as well as private ones. Well, this hope to find a suitably arranged city, or build one in words or in fact, is, I think, deeply ingrained in Plato's own conception of what it would really take to make his own life go completely well. This is at least further suggested by the fact that the Republic was not his last work of political philosophy. He wrote an even bigger dialogue called The Laws late in his life, which is once again a kind of utopian project, or perhaps a second utopian project. And he passed on that project to his student Aristotle, who constructed his own ideal city in the work we call the Politics. And the project was taken up again in Roman times by Cicero, and then under very different conditions by Augustine, and then again in modernity by a variety of thinkers and doers that you'll be learning about as this series goes on. Each one convinced somehow that for a life to go well, we must not only get our own souls in order, but we must seek to live in a community that is just and sustainable. Well, I don't suggest that Plato or Socrates or Aristotle or any other utopian thinker ever got it right, that there are great ethical questions facing us every day of our lives, our private lives as individuals, and our public lives as citizens. The pesky, demanding utopian writer demands of us that we ask over and over again at least one question. Is this life, is my life, is our collective life really good enough? Well, thank you very much. Please, in the back.
Yes, when you talk about noble lies, don't you really mean mythology?
Well, what Plato's concerned to do is, in a sense, replace one set of myths, the myths of Hesiod and Homer and so on, and then, in fact, the interpretations and rewritings and creatings of those myths by other writers, for example, the writers of tragedies. One should say that whole way of thinking about things through myth, the Athenians, the Greeks generally thought through myth, says we've got to get rid of that. That's bad myth because it's full of conflict. We've got to replace that with a new set of myths. And that's why, he talks that the noble lie is directly, it's a myth. It's a lie in that it is not actually true. That the people at the top of the society, the people who read the Republic, know that this business about being born of the earth and having, gold mixed in your soul, it's just a story. That is not, in fact, the case. But Plato, I think, believes that we need stories. We need these stories that are not actually true in order, most of us, to live out our lives in a way that won't be filled with conflict, that will allow us to be obedient in ways that will make it possible for everybody to have a collective life and a personal life that's actually worth living. So, yeah.
You say the past is a noble lie, and in the future we have a new mythology here?
For Plato, that's right. I mean, but his notion was, though, that the ordinary way of representing, as it were, the mythic past was a bad way. It's an ignoble lie. It's a harmful lie, and he's going to replace that with a good lie. They're equally untrue, but one of them, Plato says, is good for you, and one of them is bad for you. You is assuming being, somebody who's not going to be of this top group. Now, one way you can step back from this is say he's talking about this utopian community. He may not intend for it ever to actually exist. He writes this work, The Republic, which specifically says these are just going to be, fictions, and you, the reader, have access to the fact that that's a fiction. So that in some ways, he's not in at least depending on how you read the Republic, but he doesn't seem to be saying, oh, dear reader, believe this lovely lie. Rather, he's saying, well, it's going to be a lie, but it's going to be necessary.
So this is related to dialectics?
Maybe we should go down to the next question. Thank you. Sorry.
Can you elaborate a little bit on the division of labor? You rejected gender-based division and had a hierarchical division instead, with a depiction of what kind of metal you were, whether gold or silver, bronze.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, Plato was very concerned with having the right kind of divisions of labor. What he actually believed is that some people are capable of doing certain things and only certain things. He tends to think that rulership is a very high-order way to, a high-order thing to do. And that only a few people are actually capable of doing it. Lots of people are capable of doing things like making shoes and so on. Now, I think in Plato's defense, he would claim that making shoes really well is a truly worthy thing to do. That your life can be fully satisfactory. If you're a good maker of shoes, you devote yourself to making shoes, and you just don't get yourself confused by thinking you can also be a good ruler in your spare time. So that what he basically suggests is that there really isn't any difference in the innate capacities of men and women. That's a radical idea. There's nothing different fundamentally about a man's soul and a woman's soul that means that a man should always be doing this kind of labor or this kind of function in society, and a woman should always be doing this other. But he does believe that there are really fundamental differences in different peoples, so that some people really don't have in fact, almost no one has the capacity to really be a ruler. Some people have the capacity, for example, to be guardians. Most of us, he supposes, just have the capacity to do productive kind of labor.
But then it is a caste system.
That's right. It's a caste system.
It's very rigid. There is no mobility.
There is no mobility. In fact, he is absolutely hostile to the idea of mobility. And in fact, if there ever is mobility, the old Callipolis is kept going by a very elaborate kind of breeding program. And the problem is that somebody it all comes out with some weird mathematics. And you've got to have a certain number right that sort of explains who's supposed to breed with whom. And somebody, he says, at some point is going to screw up. They're going to get the number wrong, and that means some gold-souled person is going to be mating with a bronze-souled person, and it's just going to make a mess. So yes, it's more rigid than you can imagine. I mean, now turns out that, it's actually going to be the philosopher kings at the top who are going to go around sort of tapping people, saying, somehow, you're a gold soul type, come here. So it may, it's not just that you make 2 gold souls and you'll automatically get a gold soul. So it's not sort of that kind of straightforward eugenics, but there is some weird kind of eugenic program that rolls behind it. So this is why a lot of people get the creeps from Plato's Utopia. And I concluded this by saying, I sure don't want to live there. I think it's a very useful thing to think with, but it seems to me a deeply unpleasant place to actually live in. So,
is it that the base here is that this issue of dealing with conflict that separates the philosopher king from the other classes, that only if you have a certain level of education and ability to understand the universe can you wrestle with conflict, and everybody below that can't? Is that what you see?
That seems to be part of it, because it turns out that only that the people at the very top of this society are going to have access to all of this banned literature. Certain people are going to be allowed to read Hesiod. So they're actually going to be let in on the fact that there is conflict in the world, but it is apparently only 2 things, both having the right kind of philosophic soul to begin with, and then having the right kind of deep education that allows you to deal with this, that you'll eventually be, as it were, tipped off. There's this whole world of conflict and difference of opinion and so on. But by that point, you're not going to be seduced by it. You're not going to be somehow confused and turned into a person like Thrasymachus, who might have started out with a pretty good soul. He's a very smart guy. He's got a lot going for him. He can really make an argument, but he's clearly gone radically wrong at some point, that he has this embrace of injustice. So Plato's really worried about getting people who have the right capacities, giving them the right education, and then only then tipping them off to the truth about the world. So the truth is not something that most of us are actually capable of dealing with, Plato believes. And once again, this just makes Plato hard to deal with. So, yeah.
In including the allegory of the cave, was Plato suggesting that the individual who rose to the light and came back to be persecuted was the story of Socrates?
Yeah, whether the allegory of the cave is meant to be about Socrates or not, I don't know. I mean, that one of the things that Plato's concerned about is that the people who have been chosen and trained to be philosophers, the payoff to all of that is you get to spend much of your life in philosophical contemplation, than which there is nothing better, if that's what your soul is well prepared for, you say. I mean, for shoemakers, it's presumably hell. But so anyway, it's just great. I mean, it's kind of like us being, I guess, just really high all the time because wow, you're in touch with truth. I mean, that's you're in the forms and so on. But then, it turns out that you have to then periodically come back into the cave. You have to engage in actual rulership. You have to deal with all these people. You have to run them with noble lives and so on. They don't know the truth. It turns out that some of these people, some of these philosophers who are now saying it's your turn to rule, are going to be fussy. And it's going to be like, I don't want to do that. It's so sunny out here and bright. It's dark in the cave. And people might get uppity and all of this. And then the philosophers will say to this young pup, young pup, he has to be at least 50, because that's when the philosophical education takes you up to age 50. So at any rate, this rebellious type is saying, did we not cause you to be born? Did we not, in fact, give you your upbringing? Did we not, in fact, give you your education so that you could be such as you are? And that being the case, are you not doing wrong by refusing to take your part in perpetuating a society that allows others to be such as you are? The striking thing here is those of you who know Plato's other works, that's exactly the argument that the laws of Athens that Socrates imagines in his head in the dialogue that Crito make to him. They say, Socrates, we caused you to be born, we caused you to be brought up, and we caused you to be educated, and now you're going to turn on us by running away from prison? And Socrates says, ooh, no. That's exactly the same argument that the philosophers make to the potentially rebellious philosopher. It's a startling moment in which we actually begin to see the difference between Athens and Callipolis. So,
do we have any evidence at all about what kind of reception this work got in his own time? I mean, did it influence anybody?
It influenced some people. Plato's Academy was a small and highly select group of people. We know the names of some people who went there. But we have a few stories that, interestingly enough, we have a story that a woman read at least one of the books of the Republic, it was circulated in different books, was so taken by that she came to the Academy, but she recognized that the Academy was not going to be Callipolis, that women were not going to be treated equally, and so she came to the Academy dressed as a man, and was only later revealed to be a woman, and that was accepted. Maybe it's an apocryphal story, we don't know, but it does suggest that one of the reasons for Plato to write the Republic is actually to send out into the world a particular vision of what it might be to live a philosophical life, to bring people to Athens to study with him, to try to further that work. So whether it's supposed to influence you and me, I mean, by people who, I hope there are people in the room who figured that, if they knocked on the door of Plato's Academy, he would recognize, the glory of your soul and your educability and so on, and say, I see gold, come on in. But I've never had that. I've never had that arrogant belief. I don't think it was ever really meant to go out there and change the opinions of many people, but I think it was potentially meant to attract the few people who had perhaps real philosophical.
He didn't think that anyone would come to him and say, be our leader and start this.
I don't think so. There's been a lot of discussion about, was the Academy meant to be, some kind of a sort of cryptic think tank that was preparing leaders for, trying to place leaders in Greek city-states in order to try to give them new rulership. There seems to be very little evidence of that. I guess I tend to think that although Plato really desired something like a really just state and imagined that the only way you could live a fully worthwhile life would be in that, so you could really expand your capacities beyond the Academy into an entire community. I don't think he ever really thought that it would be possible to do that by just sending out, these kind of well-trained young men.
Didn't Plato educate a young man who became the king of Syracuse and who really failed?
Yeah, he, among Plato's students, was, in fact, a guy who, for a while, took over as tyrant of Syracuse. And in fact, Plato went to Syracuse, at least according to the ancient biographies, and tried to help him to, do something right there. It all just completely crashed and burned. In fact, Plato came very close to being killed. In the seventh letter, he mentions, a very strange little moment in the seventh letter, that he was about to be assassinated by some mercenaries who didn't like what he was up to. And he said that some other mercenaries, being fellow citizens of mine, warned me of their plot, and I actually escaped. It's the one moment when Plato the Athenian sort of pops into existence. It was this fellow Athenian feeling between Plato and Athenian and these mercenary Athenians, obviously poor men having to go off and fight as mercenaries. Their fellow feeling as Athenians that lead them to tip off Plato. The general assumption is that the chronology of Plato's Syracusan John, is that he goes to Syracuse, comes back, and only then writes the Republic. So although he would not, throughout his life, despise the thought that maybe you could do something like this, I don't think that the Academy was meant systematically to produce people like that, to create genuine good tyrants.
Yes. I have been confused, and I'm still trying to straighten it out, because I taught the psychology of women, and not knowing much philosophy, I quoted Plato in his Republic as saying that women were at there. And now I'm getting the idea, but I'm not sure, because this woman had to dress like a man to get into the academy. So I sort of attribute a lot of our sexism to Plato, and now I feel chagrined. Was I right or was I wrong?
Well, it's Plato, I think, in his philosophical, commitments, believed that, or was willing to state that there is no fundamental difference between women's, as it were, moral psychology and men's moral psychology. That because of that, women can be, guardians, presumably philosopher, queens, kings, as well as men. But Plato lived in the real world, surrounded by people who had certain kind of attitudes about women, who would have been, I think, deeply puzzled by a woman sitting as a student of philosophy. So once again, you don't want to put too much weight on this story. There's a lot of stories that get attached to the Academy and what happened at the Academy. They all come from very, very late Neoplatonic sources. So it only means that somebody at some point imagined this was a possible sort of story. So it means they imagined that the Republic was circulating out there. They imagined that a woman had the capacity to understand it deeply enough to say, right, that means go to the Academy and work further, but also perhaps that the society was sufficiently sexist still that she had to, have a cover story, cover book. So I wouldn't want to hang Plato too high with that. On the other hand, whether he thought, once again, that Callipolis was in any sense realistic is up for grabs, at least so I suggest.
Could Plato's Republic been kind of a pedagogical tool to evoke a lot of different utopias among his students? And in fact, he really didn't believe in such a rigid society. He didn't practice it in his academy.
That's an interesting thought. That would be a very sort of, in a sense, against the grain thought, in that Plato says over and over again in the Republic that diversity is bad. So that the idea that this pedagogical tool was meant to evoke multiple possible utopias would seem to deny the basic, argument of the Republic that the conflict and multiplicity of opinions is in fact wrong. I'd love to go where you're going, but I think that Plato's fundamental belief about the unity of knowledge, the unity of truth, the basic forms of the truth, make it somewhat unlikely that he would actually be content with the idea that this heuristic device would generate multiple interpretations. On the other hand, I think it is intended to make you think harder. It's not like a simple lesson that you just read it off and you learn the 10 principles of justice, moral psychology, and education. It's, I think, meant to leave you, in a sense, the way that Socrates' interlocutors were left saying, I need to do a lot more work. And maybe, if there's the academy to go to, I can do my work there.
Let's have one more question.
Well, do you have your hand out? Yes.
There were lots of other people that we know about in the Greece of that time who were worried about right and wrong and good and bad. Is there nothing in what Plato says that acknowledges that that some other people are also thinking about these things?
Plato was very aware that other people are thinking these things, and that's a very good point. He thinks fundamentally that the other people are getting it wrong. That what he's doing is philosophy, and what they're doing is sophism or rhetoric or something else. Plato's very worried about people who have some philosophical training and learn how to make arguments and learn how to make fools of people in arguments. He's worried that those kind of people will simply make everybody else that much sort of more suspicious about philosophers than they currently are. Plato's extremely ambitious, and I think he does believe that he's got it sorted out, and that nobody else has. But he's also looks over his shoulder at a lot of these other people pretty regularly. And I think the fact that the people that Socrates is constantly jousting with in these are, in a sense, other people who call themselves and imagine themselves as being philosophers. I think that suggests that Plato feels that he's got to constantly demonstrate through these dialogues the superiority of the tradition that he is the true heir, I think, that is the Socratic tradition.
That gets us off a great